Hello. Thank you very much for sitting down with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your name?
Mark Brnovich.
Where were you born?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan.
And where did your family originally grow up from?
Well, I always say that I have the best of all worlds since my mother was born in the former Croatia. My father's side of the family comes from Montenegro, and I'm Serbian Orthodox by religion.
Okay, so where in Montenegro exactly is your family from then?
So the Brnoviches, Montenegro is very tribal, and so they talk about the tribe. So our people are, we'll call Jashanská Nihia, which is right outside of Podgorica, which is where the current capital is.
Well, why did your family decide to immigrate from Yugoslavia to the United States?
Well, I think the same reason why people have come to the United States for generations, from the beginning of the United States, is people come here for a better opportunity. And the reality is, even today, but especially back then, there was little opportunity. You got to remember, back in the 50s, the 60s, especially in Eastern Europe, communism dominated. And if you weren't a member of the Communist Party, that affected your ability to not only earn a livelihood, but you couldn't own property. You had to be careful what you said, what you did. It might affect whether you could even go to university or not. So the bottom line is that there was little to no opportunities in Eastern Bloc countries unless you were a member of the Communist Party or unless you were fortunate enough to make it to the West.
How has being a first-generation American influenced and shaped your work ethic as you've grown up?
I always tell people that when you're a first-generation American with a funny last name, you always have to work extra hard. And I haven't told people a lot of these stories, and lately, as time's gone on, especially with what I've done professionally, I'll sometimes tell people that, like when I was growing up, for example, I grew up here in Arizona. I went to Desert Cove Elementary, Shea Middle School, Shadow Mountain High School. And when I was in grade school, Desert Cove was part of the Paradise Valley School District, there wasn't a lot of diversity. And so I spoke, and sometimes even in class, my first couple of years in school, I would sometimes start speaking Serbo-Croatian, speak a different language. We had sometimes what people would call strange or different customs. Like, for example, we celebrate Christmas on January 7th. Our Easter is, changes, and so it's not always aligned with the Western Easter. And so, there was a lot of different cultures and traditions. And so, I can remember my second grade teacher. I can remember my fourth grade teacher. I can remember my seventh grade PE coach making fun of my last name. In fact, I think until about the third or fourth grade, I thought my name was either Brontosaurusvich or Brnovich. I think that shapes your experience, though, because you realize, even at a young age, in many ways, maybe on the outside you're not different, but you are, though. You are because you have a strange last name, because people think you have weird religious customs, because you speak a foreign language that isn't, a very common language in Arizona, even to this day. I mean, there's not a lot of people that are speaking Slavic languages. And so I just think, especially, and I don't want to get too much into this, but you got to remember, especially during the Cold War, Eastern Europeans, the Russians, they were seen as the bad guys all the time. And so I think there was always some vestiges of that as well. And so, that shapes your experience. I think that in some ways I grew up extra patriotic, but I think those experiences early on made me want to succeed and made me realize that no one was going to hand me anything. And like a lot of immigrants, a lot of immigrant groups that come here, realize that, you got to make it on your own. No one's going to hand you anything.
So as someone who was born in America with family roots from Montenegro, have you ever felt like an identity crisis? So you kind of went into that a little bit about being extra patriotic, but have you ever felt too Montenegrin or conversely too American?
Yeah, I think that, the reality is that I think there's some point in your life, especially early on, where you just want to be kind of like everyone else. And so you almost in some ways distance yourself from your roots. And so, I remember one time when I was younger, I remember telling some kids when we were in grade school or whatever that, oh yeah, for celebrations, we'll, get the pig on a split or, roast lamb. And I remember someone's like, you're eating lamb? And I thought, oh my God, maybe there's something wrong with us. Doesn't everybody eat lamb at Easter or, roast a pig on a split? And I just remember in some ways, you would internalize that and then you would start almost distancing yourself from it, not being part of it. But then you kind of come back to it because it's like your whole basis. And I was always proud of who I was. But you realize you get this extra appreciation for how special it is. Like, we talk about America being kind of this fabric and this diversity and stuff. And, very often we think of diversity in one way, but we don't understand that ethnically and culturally there's this diversity that I think adds so much to the fabric of this country. And so I have found myself definitely as gotten older. Like, for example, I've made sure every summer we go back to Montenegro. And, we were just there this summer as a family. And so, I want my daughters to understand their roots and, to carry on that tradition. In fact, one of my great regrets, and my daughters get on me this all the time, is that they know a little Serbo-Croatian, but, they didn't grow up speaking in the house. And I always tell them that it was much easier when they were growing up, because my wife doesn't speak Serbo-Croatian. If they were doing something wrong, to just say, stop, instead of like, Nemoy, or don't do that, whatever, so it was a lot easier to speak English. And so I always say that we call our grandmothers Bubba, so I always say it's Bubba's fault. Bubba should have taught him Serbo-Croatian. But I'm very proud of my roots, and I feel like as I get older I've become even more connected with them.
So do you think that diaspora members can find a balance between their Balkan culture and their life in the United States? So kind of how you were saying, you've tried your best to expose your daughters to Eastern European, like Slavic culture as much as you can. Just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think this is one of my big concerns today, and I know that your project's really about the Balkans and Eastern Europe in general, and I've really been on this platform a lot lately. I've talked to some of my friends I know, people that are in professional sports, other athletes that have, names that ended Vich or Vach. And we've talked a lot about this, is that it seems like, especially if you're Eastern European, no one even says Eastern European anymore. Like I read this article recently that talked about the fact that even people in Eastern Europe, like if you're Polish, they don't call themselves Eastern Europe. They'll call themselves Central European, or, and even people in the Balkans now. You don't say you're from Eastern Europe, you say, oh, we're from Southern Europe, or we're from the Mediterranean. And so it's weird, there's been this kind of stigma that's become attached. And I think a lot of that's from the West. I remember even recently, Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, saying that, oh, we look forward to one day when the Balkans can be part of Europe. And I was like, the Balkans are part of Europe. I mean, but that's that Western mentality that I think that people from that part of the world, we've always been kind of looked down upon. And I think one of the great, not tragedies, that's not the right word, but one of the great things that I think that we can improve on is the diaspora. And whether they're from Bulgaria, or whether they're from Hungary, or whether they're from, Croatia, Montenegro, Macedonia, a lot of those countries in the region, throughout the centuries, I think Western powers have purposely divided them. We've seen it divided along religious lines. We've also seen it divided for military reasons between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Eastern Empire. We always had like Russia kind of was, the Balkans were kind of their sphere of influence. And because of that, I think that there was a lot of, in the West, a lot of negative stereotypes. And in fact, if you go back and you read the immigration acts of the early 20th century, for example, 1921, 1924, 1924 Immigration Act, it was specifically designed to exclude people from South and Eastern Europe from coming into the United States. And if you read some of the comments from the senators, the congresspeople, even President Coolidge at the time, where they were talking about, well, people from Eastern Europe have strange religious customs. They're not mentally smart. They become disoriented easily. They refuse to assimilate into culture. So those were a lot of, for hundreds of years, kind of stereotypes about people from the Balkans. And the reason why that's important for the diaspora is that I think, and I don't know this, I'm not a researcher, but I've always believed that because of that, because of the communism dominating Eastern Europe in the, through the latter half of the 20th century, that a lot of our people, our parents, our grandparents that came here, almost went out of their way to assimilate and to show how American they were. And they didn't, because there's friends I have, even in church, that never learned Serbo-Croatian. And they're, same generation as me. And so I think that there was a lot of times people wanted to distance themselves from that because either people thought you were un-American or you were communist or closet communist, or that you somehow had some weird different beliefs. And so I think a lot of times people distance themselves from their ethnic roots, and not just in the former Yugoslavia, but I think that happened in other places in the Balkans, and I think that's sad. And because of the fact that people there haven't been united generally, I think it's been easy for a lot of other people, including the West, to exploit those people, to perpetuate stereotypes, because there isn't like, for example, and I'm sorry, I know this is way too long of an answer, but for example, I was fortunate enough when I was Attorney General to go on official visits to Ireland and meet members of Parliament there, government officials, and justice ministers, and I remember thinking, if you look at Ireland, they call it the Celtic Tiger, their economy, and they have all this tech industry there now. I was thinking to myself, Ireland is almost the same size as Serbia, and yet I have been all over the world. I've been to the Middle East, Asia, anywhere. You will find an Irish bar in almost every part of the world celebrates St. Patrick's Day. And yet, like, I can't remember finding like a Serbian place almost anywhere in the world. I mean, other than maybe if you're in Belgrade or, maybe some part of the Balkans, you might find something. And so, for whatever reason, I think there are a lot of, like how many Bulgarian restaurants do we have in Phoenix? I mean, how many Macedonian places do you find? I mean, so it's almost like people, there's a reason they call it Balkanization, because of all the division and everything else that's happened historically. But I think some of that becomes self-inflicted when people came here because they wanted to distance themselves. But at the same time, part of the only place that people understood them, and you had these traditions like, sometimes celebrating Christmas or Easter on a different day, or having a slava with your family, all these customs and traditions, other people couldn't relate to. So the only place that you could is maybe to go to your church, or, the Midwest, they had community centers. And so I think, and this is the great challenge, is that, so you have all that history, and then you stack on top of it that because there hasn't been like an organized effort to push back against this narrative, like when you see movies today or you see TV shows, I mean, whether it's the Navy SEALs or the George Clooney movie, The Peacemaker, whatever it is, it's like, oh, the Serbs or the Slavs or the Viches and the Vox are the bad guys. And I think that perpetuates part of that Western mentality that there's somehow people from the Balkans are different and strange. And because we're not organized, we don't do enough to push back. And so I think that there should be an effort. Like I said, you have the Italian American League. Look at the way the Irish, like culturally, Slavic people from the Balkans have done a very poor job of being organized and kind of looking out for themselves and their identity.
So, what would you say the Montenegrin community is like in Arizona? Can you tell us a little bit more about your involvement in it?
Well, it's interesting because even to this day, even in Montenegro, for example, there's a lot of division about like, well, what is being Montenegrin? Historically, there was a lot of pride in being Montenegrin. I mean, when it was the former Yugoslavia, they had the highest percentage of, military officers in the former Yugoslav, Army and Navy. But lately, because for whatever reason, there's a lot of division about whether there's true Montenegrin identity or whether you're really Serbian and you live in Montenegro. And so, which once again, I think is very, very divisive, because I do think that Montenegro historically has a distinct, rich culture and tradition. I mean, its independence, was recognized before many other countries in Europe. And, when the Ottoman Empire controlled so much of the Balkans, they never effectively occupied Montenegro. So there's a rich tradition there of being fiercely independent, being, a warrior tradition. And there's people like, Lord Tennyson, who's written amazing poems about Montenegro. So I think that there is a distinct, rich tradition there. But once again, I don't want to use the word pan-Slavic, but I am one of these people that believes that, like I said, people of the Balkans, Slavic people, need to spend more time not worrying about what religion this person is, or worrying about, well, wait a minute, are you this ethnic identity or this ethnic identity, and your grandfather or great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did something 500 years ago. We need to get past that. We need to realize that as the world changes, the world is actually getting smaller, and I think there's an opportunity to push back against the narratives that the Balkans are some sort of backwater that you only go to or you deal with if you absolutely have to. And that's been the opinion of much of Western Europe for most of the last 100 years. So I think it's important to have that, tradition and to understand that. The community here, though, like I said, in some ways, I mean, because of the Serbian Orthodox Church, that's essentially where, the Montenegrin community is at as well. Because you got to remember, Montenegro is such a small country. It's less than 700,000 people. So, it's even when you have a community, it's so small. It's not like there's that you can, I don't want to say have a lot of influence. But the other interesting thing about Montenegro is, and I know from my own experience, is that everyone is like, there's like 1 or 2 degrees of separation, so it's like, if you want to talk to the president, I mean, it's like, oh, I can make call as so-and-so who's his chief of staff, who can get me on the phone. I mean, it's like, it's such a small world that everyone seems to know each other, but it is small. So that means that, maybe if you have, a few dozen people here, people tend to know who they are, but, once again, people are living their lives and going on, and sometimes you'll see people at church, when there's an Orthodox holiday or Christmas, and, and everyone and their aunt and uncle shows up, but it's not very organized.
The 2 degrees of separation is really interesting because my dad was born in Bosnia, but his dad is from Montenegro. And then when we go, and then somebody asks, oh, what's your last name? They know exactly the village your last name comes from, but in like Serbia, it's not the same exact thing. Yeah. Montenegro, it's very familial.
Yes. At one point, someone said I was the most famous non-athlete from Montenegro. But, I've been to bars and restaurants in Montenegro, and people see your credit card, and they'll be like, oh, because my cousin was the national soccer coach, and, 10 years ago. And so people, oh, yeah, your people are from, and they know exactly where you're from or where your family's from. It's a very small world there.
It is like a tight-knit community. So then going back to your experiences in Montenegro, earlier you mentioned that you try your best to have your daughters go back in the summers. Can you share like a memorable experience or two that you guys have had there while visiting the country?
People in Montenegro are very well known for their hospitality and how they treat guests, and even a stranger. And they will literally, it's like no one ever leaves your house thirsty or hungry, and they will give you the shirt off their back. And so one of my friends there, he grew up there, he was born there, and he brought me to his friend's house. And they live in a place called Budva, which is right on the water, and there's this old fortress there. And I didn't even know people lived in there, but his family lived there for like 300 or 400 years, that house right on the water. And we went there. We never met his friends, but they were friends of my friend. And, they grilled, and we had fish and, rakia and wine. And the wine there's amazing. And, we were there for hours. And it was like by the time we left, we were full, and we definitely had a lot to drink. But we were like old friends, and it was just that spirit of hospitality and like having my girls be able to see that. And, we've been to, like we went to, you go to my cousins there, and, maybe you go to dinner at his house and stuff. And, I don't want to say you expect it, but, if it's someone related to you, you expect them to, really roll out the red carpet or whatever, and, kill a pig for you or whatever. But but like even people that are like 1 degree of separation, like just the fact that they were willing to do that. And I think the other thing that's just kind of funny is that when we go there, at least the last few times, I usually have to pack a suit, even if we're there in the summer, because I'll end up having to go meet the president or the prime minister or something like that, and have these meetings. And so when we were there, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I had a meeting with the president. I had this interview, and the front page of one of the national newspapers, I was on it. There was a picture of me talking to the president of the country. And so I go to the grocery store. I walk to the grocery store that's by where we're staying, and I go in there and I speak the language. So I was like, I bought like three or four newspapers, like Montenegrin newspapers, and I go to the the checkout. My daughters are with me, and I kind of put the newspaper down, and so I say to the lady, I was like, Taj Čovjek's Leo Dobro. I was like, this good looking guy here, whatever, like on the thing. And she looks at me and goes, eh. And so my kids thought it was so funny. I was like, well, I wasn't sure she was just like, yeah, because the politics, or because like Like, I'm not a good-looking guy now, so there's a lot of stories like that. And look, Montenegro's amazing because, look, there's a lot of development there now. There's world-class resorts coming there. And, I mean, like I said, I could tick off a bunch of stories. We were there 2 years ago, and we were and I was upset because we couldn't get chairs on the beach. These are first world problems. And I was, like, arguing or telling the manager something like, we're spending all this money, we need to have, chairs on the beach, and my wife's like, and I'm telling them Serbian and some English, and my wife's like, hey, that guy and his family is staring at you. And I was like, I don't care if they're staring. I want to make sure we get beach chairs tomorrow. And I'm telling this guy, she said, well, you probably should look at this guy. And I turn around, and I go, is Steve Novak? And it's like, there's like Novak Djokovic watching me argue with this guy. And then I go, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. And then I start talking to him about the U.S. Open. So it's like a random, it's like I said, it's almost like a small, it really is a small city. Montenegro's got less than 100,000 people. And so there's just been a lot of like very pleasant memories of, whether it's going to the ocean or the beach, and there's a restaurant we love there that's right on the water that we go every time we're there. We love to go to, and it's, for $40 you can get everyone fed with dinner and a bottle of wine, and it's just a lot of fun.
As a final question, what advice do you have for us on preserving our cultures while still living in America?
I think it's important that to be proud of your ethnic identity, and what I mean by that is that like I'll tell you another anecdote. When I was at the Department of Justice, I was a federal prosecutor, and this wasn't that long ago. This was 15 years ago, and people that worked with me in the Federal Department of Justice used to make jokes all the time, like about, hey, do you guys get tracksuits? Like, what age do you guys get the tracksuit at? Is that like during grade school or high school? And, when do you smoke your first Marlboro cigarette? Like, I mean, like a lot of the cliches about Eastern Europeans. And you just kind of laugh it off, and I've talked to my daughters once again about this a lot, is that, if you were making those kind of stereotypical jokes about other people or other regions of the world, they would be completely unacceptable, And so I think that a lot of times we haven't had enough kind of pride or sense of belonging. And once again, I think, I'm not a psychologist or I'm not a sociologist, but, maybe that's because for generations we were kind of beat down and like kind of the West thought lesser of us, so we almost have an identity crisis. And then all the Hollywood and the stereotypes, like I said, during the communist era, bad people in Eastern Europe. And so I think kind of understanding where we come from and how it's something to be very proud of. And there's a rich history, there's a rich tradition, and people in the West don't know it because they don't get taught it, they don't know it, and there's not enough of people from Bulgaria or Macedonia or Montenegro or Croatia, whatever, Serbia, that talk about it. Like, oh my gosh, the second printing press, after the Gutenberg press was in the Balkans. I mean, people say the fork was invented in the Balkans. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but I've always been told that. I mean, so there's this amazing rich history that too often the West doesn't know about. And I do think, and I have spoken to some people about this recently, is that how do you organize the diaspora? I don't call it a pan-Slavic movement, but have some sort of kind of pro-Balkan, pro-Slavic organization, so that way when they're having the terrorist or the bad guys in the movie, it's like, wait a minute, in the history of the United States, there's never been an act of terrorism done by someone from Serbia. I mean, but you wouldn't know that if you watch Hollywood movies or, you see some of the, TV shows and stuff like that, So I think that it's important to try to like understand your roots. It's important to work together. And since we as a people, as a region, are always fighting amongst ourselves. And like I said, I think a lot of that was perpetuated over the years because of the Ottoman occupation, and then the West had various reasons for keeping the Balkans divided and not united. And so I wish there needs to be some sort of effort or organization or nonprofit so people understand their roots, they're proud of their roots, and then here in the West, United States, you got to have an effective way of, pushing back and, like setting the agenda, setting the message. And I'll give you one last example of this, and I didn't want to talk about me per se, but, when I was running for the U.S. Senate, I used to tell people that whether you're Greek Orthodox or, whatever, Orthodox community, there is no one right now in the U.S. Senate that's Orthodox, any type of Orthodox. I mean, Serbian, Russian, Greek, any of Assyrian, any of the Orthodox. And there might be, I don't know if there still is, there might be a couple of people, less than a handful, in Congress, in the House, but no one in the Senate. And when you think about underrepresented communities or underrepresented ethnic identities, I mean, there's a whole huge part of our society, our culture here in the United States, that doesn't even have, members in the executive branch or in the U.S. Senate, and barely any, maybe 2 or 3 in the House. And when I was running, I literally had people, sometimes people in the Orthodox community, whatever, supporting somebody else because Donald Trump supported somebody else. And so, and I'm not saying that everyone has to have some monolithic agreement, but so often when we're divided, you can't get stuff done in the United States unless you have loud voices. And whether that's in the media or whether that's in politics, you got to have that. And I think too often, at least my experience, and I'm not trying to generalize or stereotype, but very often, I mean, like when I was on our church board 25 years ago, I was on the church board, and I'd be in meetings and people were like, well, of course we're right, so we don't need to do anything else. And I'd be like, well, that's not the way the United States works. I mean, just because you think you're right, if, a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? I mean, there's a reason, people use that cliche and that old philosophical saying, because it's like, if people have a certain notion of this is the way these people are from the Balkans, and nothing's ever done to either change that stereotype or people there just kind of blow it off and laugh about it. And like I said, I've been guilty of this, like when I was at DOJ, yeah, okay, yeah, I got my first tracksuit and gold chain when I was 10 years old, we fall prey to that instead of saying, wait a minute, no, that's wrong, like you wouldn't talk that way if I were, a different race or a different ethnic identity. Standing up for ourselves and then taking that next step of organizing people in whether it's in athletics or whether it's in government, whether it's in Hollywood, to kind of support our ideas and values and push back against those stereotypes. And last thing I want to say about this, I don't get too much on my soapbox, but I was, like I said, I know professional athletes all over the world that are Slavic in nature. And we were talking about this, is that, I mean, if you look at someone like Djokovic, for example, the tennis player, the way he's been treated, I mean, he's the GOAT, right? He's objectively, he is the greatest tennis player. He's won more majors than anybody. Everything's happened. And yet he couldn't play in the US Open. He couldn't play in the Australian Open. And, there's a lot of people that say very nasty things about him, but everyone that's met him, everyone's talked to him, like people say he's a nicer guy than Federer. I don't know. I've never met Federer. I've met Djokovic. But I think there's some inherent and subtle anti-Slavic bias there. When you look at Jokic, they just won the finals. The Nuggets did this year. Jokic statistically had the best numbers ever in the history of the NBA for like a center. He dominated. And yet there were a lot of NBA announcers and people on TV that were talking him down, saying how terrible he was. In fact, there was one of the voters for MVP didn't even vote for him in the top 5. And, not taking anything away from Joel Embiid, who plays for the Sixers, but statistically, Djokovic was way better. His team was better with him. And there's this controversy about like, well, where should even he gotten votes or whatever. But then you saw what happened in the finals. He had like the greatest finals ever for a big man. He averaged like a triple-double. And I don't know, maybe it's because he's kind of, froppy, whatever. Maybe it's the way he looks. But then, I always wonder, like, is it because he's an itch? Because he's, from the former Yugoslavia, that the media automatically has like a certain stereotype and they look at him a certain way. And I know that when, for example, my friend Vlade Divac, who played professional basketball for the Lakers and Sacramento Kings, I mean, he caught a lot of crap when he was in the NBA, especially when the war was going on in the 90s and after that. And so I think that sometimes when you're Slavic, you have to be 2 or 3 times as good just for people to notice and say, you're doing a good job. And we need to change that.